Yellow pigment glows through 3 layers of paint at midnight. The Conservation Laboratory at the University of Oslo Aula, January 2003. Infrared reflectography reveals that Edvard Munch repainted the central sun disk in his monumental mural, The Sun, at least 3 times between 1910 and 1916, each layer attempting to capture something he could not quite reach. Cross-section analysis, documented by conservator Tine Frøysaker, shows cadmium yellow mixed with lead white in the topmost application, a combination that creates optical instability under certain lighting conditions. According to the Munch Museum's technical files, this is not unusual for Munch's late-period work, but the repetition here, the return again and again to the same burning center, suggests something beyond technique. This is not fiction. This is what this painting still reveals. What does it mean to paint hope in the middle of grief? To create an image of eternal mourning while watching your own body fail? The sun in Munch's mural measures over 3 meters across, radiating across 11.5 meters of canvas, designed to flood the main hall of Oslo University with perpetual dawn. But hidden in its layers is a darker story, one about a man trying to paint his way past death, about institutional power reshaping personal vision, and about how we memorialize optimism in an age that no longer believes in it fully. The question that haunts every viewer who stands before this massive canvas is simple and impossible. Did Munch believe in the light he painted? Or was he performing belief for a nation that needed it? If you are listening to this somewhere between 10 at night and 3 in the morning, you are in good company. Many of us seek these quiet hours to think about art differently, to let paintings speak in ways that daylight does not permit. I would love to hear what draws you to this particular hour, to these particular stories. Drop a comment below about your own late-night art rituals. And if you find value in these deep dives into a single painting's hidden life, consider subscribing. We are building something here, a space for slow looking and careful listening. Now, let us step closer to the sun. You are standing in the main ceremonial hall of the University of Oslo on a December morning in 1916. The building itself is new, finished only that year, designed in a stripped-down classical style by architect Johan Ellefsen. The hall smells of fresh plaster and linseed oil. Above you, covering the entire south wall, Munch's sun fills the space with bands of yellow, orange, and pale green, radiating from a central disc. The colors are not quite natural. They pulse with an intensity that feels almost uncomfortable, too bright, too insistent. You notice how the rays do not fade gradually, but maintain their strength almost to the edges of the canvas, as if the light refuses to acknowledge darkness. The figures below, tiny human forms scattered across a rocky Norwegian coastline, seem to emerge from shadow into this unrelenting illumination. Then you notice something odd. The brushwork in the center is thick, built up in layers that create actual texture, while the outer rays are thinner, more transparent. It is as if Munch could not stop trying to perfect the source while letting the rest of the composition breathe. This is the contradiction that launches everything that follows. Between 1907 and 1909, the Norwegian art world was consumed by debates about national style and modernist experimentation. The dissolution of the union with Sweden in 1905 had created both creative freedom and cultural anxiety. What did it mean to be Norwegian in art, now that Norway stood alone? The Artists' Association in Christiania, as Oslo was then called, was split between those who favoured the French-influenced naturalism of Christian Krogh and Fritz Thaulow, and those who championed a more symbolic, emotionally direct approach rooted in northern light and landscape. Munch occupied an uneasy position in these debates. By 1909, he was 56 years old, internationally known for The Scream and his Frieze of Life series, but also notorious for his bohemian lifestyle and breakdowns. According to letters preserved at the Munch Museum, dated between 1907 and 1908, he was drinking heavily and experiencing what he called nervous exhaustion, a condition that led to his admission to Dr. Daniel Jacobsen's clinic in Copenhagen in October 1908. The normal workshop practice for monumental commissions in Scandinavia at this time involved assistants preparing canvases, mixing colours according to set formulas, and blocking in background areas under the master's supervision. Munch rejected this entirely. Studio photographs from his property at Ikeli, outside Christiania, taken between 1910 and 1913, and now held in the Munch Museum archives, show him working alone on enormous unstretched canvases laid directly on the ground in his open-air studio. He built temporary shelters to protect the work from rain, but deliberately exposed the paintings to sun, wind, and even snow, believing that weathering improved the surface. This was not romantic primitivism. It was a calculated assault on academic methods. Hidden in this apparent chaos was a methodical artist testing the durability of modern industrial pigments under extreme conditions, gathering data for what he knew would be his largest and most permanent work. The first public hint of transformation came in spring 1909. The competition for decorating the newly planned University Assembly Hall was announced in March. According to the competition brief preserved in the University of Oslo archives, the commission called for murals expressing the relationship between light, knowledge, and national identity. 11 artists were invited to submit proposals. Munch was not among them. He was considered too radical, too unstable, and frankly too old for a project that would define modern Norwegian public art. But on June 12, 1909, 2 days after being discharged from Dr. Jacobsen's clinic, Munch wrote to his friend Jens Thies, director of the National Gallery, declaring his intention to compete anyway. The letter, archived at the National Library of Norway, is remarkable for its clarity. He describes seeing the sun through the windows of the clinic during his convalescence, how its daily appearance became a form of discipline, a proof that stability and return were possible. He wanted to paint that sun, he wrote, not as symbol, but as fact, as the most reliable thing in the Norwegian sky. His workshop of one became a campaign. Between June and December 1909, Munch produced 12 full-scale preparatory studies, each exploring different color relationships and compositional schemes. He worked simultaneously on multiple versions, moving between canvases to let layers dry and to compare effects. Studio account books, transcribed by Munch scholar Arne Eggum in his 1990 study Edvard Munch, Paintings, Sketches and Studies, show purchases of cadmium yellow from the Christiania paint supplier H.T. Hombo, lead white from Germany, and zinc white from England. The total expenditure on materials alone for the preparatory phase exceeded 2,000 kroner, roughly equivalent to 2 years' wages for a skilled craftsman. Munch was gambling his financial stability on an unsolicited proposal for a commission he had not been invited to compete for. Meanwhile, the official competition was proceeding. The selection committee, chaired by University rector Waldemar Christopher Brugger, reviewed submissions in January 1910. According to minutes preserved in the university archives, the committee was deadlocked between two proposals, one by Emmanuel Vigeland, featuring allegorical figures representing the sciences, and another by Edvard Munch, depicting Norwegian historical scenes. Neither satisfied the full committee. Then, on February 8, 1910, Jens Thies arranged for several committee members to visit Munch's outdoor studio at Ekeli. What they saw stopped the official competition in its tracks. Munch had constructed a narrative across multiple canvases that could be read as either sequence or symphony. The central panel, already designated as the sun, showed his radiating disk above a Norwegian coastal landscape. Flanking panels depicted Alma Mater, a seated woman nursing an infant, surrounded by learning children, and history, an old man telling stories to a youth beneath an oak tree. But it was the sun panel that dominated. Art historian Reinhold Heller, in his 2003 essay Munch's Monumental Project, published in the journal Artibus et Historiae, notes that committee members described the color intensity as almost unbearable in person, that the yellows seemed to advance off the canvas toward the viewer. This was not decoration. It was assault by optimism. The technical means by which Munch achieved this intensity reveal both innovation and desperation. Paint analysis conducted during the 2011 conservation campaign at the Aula, published in the journal Studies in Conservation, shows that Munch applied cadmium yellow directly over a white ground with minimal underpainting, allowing the reflective base to amplify the pigment's natural luminosity. In the central disc, he added layers of transparent zinc yellow mixed with poppy oil, a slower drying medium that allowed him to work wet into wet for extended periods, blending colors until they seemed to emit rather than reflect light. The outermost rays contained traces of chrome yellow, a pigment already falling out of favor due to its tendency to darken, but which Munch chose for its raw, acidic brightness. He was willing to sacrifice longevity for intensity, betting that the sheer force of the color would carry its meaning across decades, even as the chemistry degraded. But institutional acceptance came with conditions. The university committee, convinced by what they had seen but wary of Munch's reputation, offered him the commission in March 1911 with strict oversight provisions. He would work under the supervision of architect Ellefsen, submit progress reports every 3 months, and agree to modifications if the committee deemed the final work unsuitable for an academic setting. A contract held at the University of Oslo archives, signed April 15, 1911, stipulated that Munch would forfeit his entire fee if he failed to deliver by December 1914. The pressure was institutional and existential. At 57, with a history of breakdowns and a reputation for unreliability, Munch was being given one chance to prove he could function as a public artist rather than a private visionary. The expansion phase, 1911 to 1914, tested whether that distinction was even possible. Munch treated the commission like a laboratory experiment in the durability of modern materials and his own mental state. He continued his practice of exposing the canvases to weather, now with the added anxiety that Oslo winters could destroy months of work overnight. Studio photographs from winter 1912, preserved in the Munch Museum collection, show snow accumulating on stretched canvases propped against outdoor walls. In letters to his friend Christian Gerloff, dated February 1912, and archived at the National Library. Munch describes scraping frost off the paint surface before resuming work, testing whether the pigments would survive the freeze-thaw cycle. This was not neglect. It was an empirical study of permanence conducted through his own art. The economic infrastructure supporting this work reveals the complex relationship between artistic autonomy and market dependence. Munch financed the project partly through the university's advance payments, but primarily through continued sales of prints and smaller paintings. Sales ledgers from the Blomqvist auction house in Christiania, documented in Gerdvoll's catalogue Edvard Munch, The Complete Graphic Works, show that between 1911 and 1914, Munch sold over 300 prints, mostly versions of earlier motifs like the Kiss and Madonna, to German and Norwegian collectors. The irony was precise. He funded his vision of public optimism through private circulation of images depicting anxiety, desire, and death. The market for darkness paid for the painting of light. Parallel to the formal work, Munch was conducting a second, hidden project. In notebooks preserved at the Munch Museum and partially transcribed in scholar Arne Eggem's 1984 study, Edvard Munch's Notes, he recorded detailed observations about color perception under different emotional states. He wrote about painting the sun while experiencing what he called black moods, about forcing himself to mix yellows when his mind was pulling toward greys and blues. One entry from August 1912 describes standing before the canvas at dawn, trying to paint the light he was actually seeing rather than the light he felt. The gap between optical fact and emotional truth became the central technical problem of the project. Could paint carry both simultaneously, or did honesty require choosing one? By 1913, the cultural context was shifting in ways that changed the stakes of Munch's Sun. Tensions across Europe were escalating toward what would become the First World War. In Christiania's art circles, according to exhibition reviews preserved in the periodical Verdensgang and analyzed by art historian Patricia Berman in her 2002 book, In Another Light, Danish Painting in the 19th Century, debates about national identity were becoming more urgent and more militarized. Some critics began to argue that Munch's Sun was not optimistic enough, that it lacked the heroic clarity needed for a nation preparing to defend its neutrality. Others found it too aggressive, a martial sun rather than a nurturing one. Munch found himself caught between demands for nationalism and accusations of excess, unable to satisfy either camp. Then the voices inside the project began to speak more clearly. Tille Durieux, a German actress and model who sat for Munch during this period, described in her 1920 memoir, Eine Tür steht offen, her experience in his studio. She recalled him painting furiously on the sun panel while barely acknowledging her presence, muttering about needing to finish before the light changed, before his eyes failed, before the committee lost patience. She noted that he seemed to be racing not just institutional deadlines, but biological ones, as if the painting had to be completed before his body gave out. Medical records from Dr. Karl Schreiner, Munch's physician in Christiania during this period, and referenced in medical historian Øyvind Larsen's 1994 article in the Norwegian Medical Journal, note recurring eye problems, possibly related to overexposure to bright light during outdoor painting, and persistent stomach issues, likely stress-related. The sun that he was painting was literally damaging his ability to see. The University Oversight Committee, rather than supporting Munch through these challenges, intensified the pressure. Meeting minutes from June 1913, held in the university archives, record concerns about the central sun's colour being too intense for sustained viewing in an academic hall where speeches and ceremonies would take place. Committee member Professor Christian Schnittler, an art historian, proposed that Munch tone down the yellows and add more atmospheric perspective to soften the rays. Munch refused. In a letter to the committee dated July 3, 1913, preserved at the Munch Museum, he wrote that moderation would kill the concept that the sun's power lay precisely in its refusal to be comfortable. He offered a compromise. He would adjust the surrounding panels to provide visual relief, but the sun itself would remain as he had painted it. The committee, frustrated but backed into a corner by public anticipation of the project, reluctantly agreed. What contemporaries missed, and what conservation science has now revealed, was the literal darkness embedded in the light. Stratigraphic analysis published by conservator Irina Sandu in the 2011 volume, Munch's Aula Paintings, Science and Conservation, shows that beneath the final layers of cadmium yellow in the central disc are earlier attempts painted in duller earth yellows and Naples yellow, pigments more traditionally associated with sunlight in 19th century painting. Munch was not simply revising for technical reasons. He was systematically replacing naturalistic light with something more synthetic, more artificial, perhaps more honest about the constructed nature of optimism. The sun he finally delivered was not the sun anyone actually sees. It was the sun someone forces themselves to believe in. The business infrastructure around the project became its own form of testimony. Invoices from stretcher maker Johannes Berg, canvas supplier Håkon Stang, and varnish manufacturer Otto Wallstad, all preserved in the Munch Museum's archives, show that between 1911 and 1916, Munch spent over 15,000 kroner on materials and fabrication, more than 3 times the university's commission fee. He was effectively paying to create public art, subsidizing a nationalistic project with his own diminishing resources. Letters to his brother Andreas, dated 1914 and held at the National Library, express anxiety about money running out before the work was complete, about having to sell family property to continue. The financial pressure added to the biological and institutional pressures already accumulating. Installation began in December 1914, delayed from the original deadline but ahead of the building's official opening. Engineers employed by architect Ellefsen built a specialized mounting system using brass hooks and reinforced stretchers to support the massive canvases against the hall's curved walls. According to construction logs preserved in the university archives, the sun panel required 4 days to position correctly, with Munch present throughout, insisting on minute adjustments to catch available light from the south-facing windows. Witnesses, including university porter Olav Hansen, whose account was recorded in a 1955 oral history project archived at the Oslo Museum, described Munch standing in the empty hall at sunset on December 18, 1914, watching how natural light interacted with his painted sun. Hansen recalled him saying something that sounded like, "Now we will see if it works," though he could not be certain of the exact words. But the collision that would define the painting's meaning was already in motion. The First World War had begun in August 1914. Norway maintained neutrality, but the conflict's psychological impact penetrated even insulated academic spaces. When the Aula officially opened on September 3, 1916, Europe was deep into the Somme offensive. Over 1 million casualties would occur in that single battle. In this context, Munch's Eternal Mourning took on a quality nobody had anticipated during the design phase. It became a form of defiance against evidence, a painted argument that renewal was still possible when the world suggested otherwise. But was it sincere defiance or desperate denial? The critical reception split precisely along this line. Reviews from the opening ceremony, preserved in newspapers Aftenposten and Tidens Tine, and analysed by Munch scholar Marit Lander in her 1989 dissertation, reveal a pattern. Academic critics praised the work's technical ambition and its suitability for a hall dedicated to learning and enlightenment. They described the sun as a symbol of reason dispelling ignorance, perfectly aligned with university values. But younger artists and radical critics found something disturbing in its relentlessness. Poet Herman Wildenwey, writing in the literary journal Kringshar in October 1916, described feeling assaulted by the painting's optimism, its refusal to acknowledge the darkness not just in the world, but in human consciousness. He called it a beautiful lie, and he seemed uncertain whether that was praise or critique. Munch himself fell silent about the work after installation. In notebooks from 1917 and 1918, held at the Munch Museum, he barely mentions the Aula project. The entries shift to plans for smaller, darker works, interiors and night scenes. It is as if, having painted the sun, he needed to return to shadows to maintain some kind of psychological balance. Medical records from this period, again referenced in Larsen's study, note continued eye problems and the onset of what Munch called fatigue, possibly early signs of the influenza that would ravage Europe in 1918. He survived the pandemic, but the experience seems to have confirmed something about the fragility of the light he had painted. The failed responses began almost immediately after installation, over-varnishing during routine maintenance in the 1920s. Documented in university maintenance, logs preserved in the Oslo city archives applied heavy layers of natural resin varnish that yellowed and darkened the surface, ironically dimming the sun that was supposed to shine eternally. Conservation photographs from 1928 show the central disc looking muddy and indistinct, its rays muted by layers of degraded coating. The university's stated intent to protect the painting achieved the opposite effect, slowly suffocating the light Munch had worked so hard to intensify. This pattern would repeat, good intentions damaging the work while claiming to preserve it. Institutional misunderstanding compounded the problem. In 1937, Norway's National Exhibitions Office proposed touring photographs of the Aula murals as part of cultural diplomacy efforts. According to correspondence held at the National Museum archives, the proposal framed the sun as a symbol of Nordic purity and national vigour, language uncomfortably close to fascist aesthetics, then rising in Germany. Munch, still alive but largely withdrawn from public life, wrote a brief letter in March 1937, preserved at the Munch Museum, requesting his name be removed from the promotional materials. The letter gives no reason, but the timing and context speak clearly. His son was being claimed by a politics of light he wanted no part of. The true collision came in April 1940. German forces invaded Norway, occupying Oslo within days. The university became an administrative center for occupation authorities. Nazi officials held ceremonies in the Aula beneath Munch's sun. Photographs from this period held in the Norwegian Resistance Museum archives, show German officers standing before the painting during official functions. The sun, intended to represent enlightenment and renewal, now illuminated the rhetoric of conquest. Munch, living at Eckerli under occupation, could see the Aula building from his property. He never spoke publicly about how his painting was being used, but in a notebook entry from May 1940, archived at the Munch Museum and transcribed by Eggum, he wrote a single line: "The sun shines on everything." It could be read as acceptance or devastation, universalism or despair. After liberation in 1945, restoration efforts began to remove war damage and decades of grime. Conservation work in 1947 and 1948, documented in reports by conservator Leif Eliasson, held at the National Museum, revealed the extent of degradation. Not only had varnish darkened, but some of Munch's most vulnerable pigments, particularly the chrome yellows in the outer rays, had oxidized and browned. The challenge facing conservators was philosophical as much as technical. Should they restore Munch's original intense yellows using modern materials, or preserve the aged appearance as part of the painting's historical life? The decision, made by a committee of university administrators and museum professionals, was to stabilize rather than restore fully. The sun would remain somewhat dimmed, a testament to time's passage rather than an eternal morning. Whether this was wise conservation or institutional timidity remains debated. From the 1950s through the 1980s, the painting settled into a curious role. It became a backdrop for student ceremonies, graduation speeches, and academic rituals, present but not quite seen. Generations of students passed through the hall without really looking at the sun, its meaning absorbed into institutional routine. Art historian Tone Skedsmo, in her 2000 study, Reception and Neglect, the Aula Murals, after 1945, notes that very few scholarly articles about the painting were published between 1950 and 1990. It had become invisible through overfamiliarity, a fate perhaps worse than censorship. The question it originally posed about whether painted light could carry genuine hope was forgotten because the painting itself stopped being a question and became merely decoration. Revival began not through art history, but through conservation science. The 2003 study by Tine Frøysaker and colleagues, mentioned earlier, used infrared and X-ray analysis to peer beneath the surface layers, revealing Munch's working process in unprecedented detail. What emerged was evidence of obsessive reworking, of a man who could not stop adjusting the central disc even after the painting was officially complete. Technical photography showed that Munch returned to the installed mural in 1917 and made small adjustments to the sun's edges, refining contours visible only at certain angles of light. He was not satisfied. Perhaps he could never be satisfied, because the gap between the light he wanted to paint and the light he could produce was unbridgeable, not through technical limitation, but through existential honesty. The comprehensive conservation campaign from 2009 to 2011, led by conservators at the University of Oslo and documented in multiple publications, faced the question that had been avoided for decades: how bright should the sun be? After extensive research into Munch's materials and methods, the team decided to remove all post-original varnish layers and apply a minimal protective coating using modern synthetic resins that would not yellow. The cleaning revealed colors more intense than anyone alive had seen. Students and faculty attending ceremonies after reopening in 2012 reported feeling almost overwhelmed by the yellow, by a brightness that seemed to deny the subdued northern light outside the windows. The painting, restored toward its original state, was once again uncomfortable, which may have been Munch's intention all along. What patterns repeat across time? The impulse to paint hope in impossible circumstances appears again and again in modern art, from Matisse's cutouts created while bedridden in old age, to Mark Rothko's chapel paintings, wrestling with transcendence and doubt. Munch's son anticipates these later attempts to use colour as a form of argument against despair, but it also exposes their fragility. Paint cannot actually generate light, only reflect and absorb it. The brightness we see is always borrowed from sources beyond the canvas, from museum spotlights or window daylight or the phosphorescence of digital screens. The optimism is always mediated, always dependent on conditions the artist cannot fully control. We learned from Munch's son that institutional spaces reshape art's meaning regardless of artist intention, that public commissions negotiate between personal vision and collective need, and that sometimes the gap between those poles becomes the work's deepest subject. We learned that materials decay, and that decay is not separate from meaning, but integral to it, that a darkened sun might tell us more truth than a restored one. We learned that paintings can be uncomfortable, and that discomfort might be a form of respect, forcing us to work harder to understand what is being offered. What we have not learned, or what we keep forgetting, is how to hold complexity when we want symbols to be simple. Munch's son is neither purely optimistic nor cynically false. It is a man trying to paint beyond his own doubt while acknowledging that doubt shapes every brushstroke. It is a nation asking art to provide certainty during uncertainty, then being troubled when art delivers intensity instead of comfort. It is light that depends on darkness to define its edges, hope that knows its own fragility. The painting hangs in the Aula still, south wall, 3 meters of yellow radiating across a hall that has seen celebrations, protests, occupations, and the ordinary drift of academic years. If you stood before it now, late at night when the hall is empty and only emergency lighting glows dimly from the exits, you might notice how the rays seem to gather what little light remains, how even in near darkness the yellows hold some luminosity. That might be Munch's final gift, not a sun that denies the night, but one that persists through it, not brightly perhaps, but stubbornly, refusing to disappear completely. Whether that persistence is victory or just survival, whether it is hope or only its echo, the painting does not answer. It leaves us standing before it, deciding what we see, what we need to see, and whether there is any difference between the two.